In March 2003, a United States-led coalition invaded Iraq and overthrew the government of Saddam Hussein. The invasion was presented as a decisive operation in the wider war on terror, launched after the September 11 attacks. But what began as a rapid military campaign became a long and destabilizing conflict. The Iraq War lasted from 2003 to 2011 as a major U.S. military occupation and insurgency, and its consequences continued long after American combat forces officially withdrew. It reshaped Iraq's politics, deepened sectarian divisions, damaged trust in Western intelligence and leadership, and helped create conditions that later allowed the Islamic State to rise. To understand the war, it is not enough to look only at the invasion. The key question is how a campaign designed to remove one government turned into years of violence, political crisis, and regional instability. The roots of the Iraq War lay in the political climate after September 11. The Bush administration argued that the United States faced a new kind of threat from terrorism, hostile regimes, and weapons of mass destruction. Iraq, ruled by Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist government, became a central target of that thinking. Saddam had previously fought wars against Iran and Kuwait, used chemical weapons in the past, and defied some international demands after the 1991 Gulf War. These facts helped make Iraq appear dangerous to many policymakers. In October 2002, the U.S. Congress passed a bipartisan resolution authorizing President George W. Bush to use military force against Iraq. Supporters argued that waiting could be too risky. Critics warned that the evidence was weak and that war could unleash consequences no one could control. The main public justification for invasion centered on claims that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, often called WMDs. U.S. and British leaders argued that Saddam's government had chemical or biological weapons programs, and possibly nuclear ambitions. They also suggested links between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, the terrorist network responsible for 9/11. These claims were powerful because they connected Iraq to the fears of the post-9/11 era. But they later collapsed under scrutiny. No stockpiles of WMDs were found in Iraq after the invasion. In 2004, the 9/11 Commission concluded there was no credible evidence of a cooperative relationship between Saddam and Al-Qaeda. The gap between the claims used to justify war and the evidence found afterward became one of the central controversies of the entire conflict. Internationally, the legal basis for the war was deeply disputed. The United States argued that action could be justified through anticipatory self-defense and by earlier United Nations Security Council resolutions related to Iraq's disarmament obligations. But many governments and legal experts disagreed, arguing that the invasion lacked fresh Security Council authorization. Kofi Annan, then Secretary General of the United Nations, later said the war was illegal under international law because it violated the UN Charter. In Britain, the 2016 Shilkut report concluded that the UK joined the invasion before peaceful options had been exhausted and that the threat from Iraq had been presented with a certainty that was not justified. These debates mattered because they shaped how the war was viewed around the world, not only as a military intervention, but as a crisis of legitimacy. The war began on March 20, 2003, with a bombing campaign widely described as shock and awe. The United States was joined by the United Kingdom, Australia, and Poland in the initial invasion. Coalition air power struck Iraqi command centers, military targets, and symbols of the regime, while ground forces moved north toward Baghdad. Militarily, the invasion phase was swift. Iraqi forces were quickly overwhelmed, and within weeks Saddam Hussein's government collapsed. Images of his statues being pulled down became symbols of the regime's fall. Saddam himself escaped at first, but he was captured later in 2003 and executed in 2006 after trial by Iraqi authorities. The coalition had achieved its immediate goal, removing Saddam. But removing a government was not the same as building a stable state. After the regime fell, Iraq entered a power vacuum. The state had been built around Saddam's authoritarian system, and when that system collapsed, basic order broke down in many areas. Looting spread, institutions weakened, and the occupying authorities faced the enormous task of governing a country with deep political, ethnic, and religious divisions. The Coalition Provisional Authority, the U.S.-led body that administered Iraq after the invasion, made decisions that remain heavily criticized. Among the most consequential were moves to remove Ba'ath party members from public life and to disband the Iraqi army. These policies were intended to prevent Saddam loyalists from returning to power. But they also left many trained soldiers, officials, and professionals unemployed, angry, and armed, creating fertile ground for resistance and insurgency. The conflict soon shifted from conventional war to insurgency. Coalition forces and the new Iraqi government faced attacks from former regime elements, nationalist militants, Islamist extremists, and other armed groups. Roadside bombs, assassinations, kidnappings, and suicide attacks became part of daily life. At the same time, Iraq's sectarian divisions grew more dangerous. Saddam's regime had been dominated by Sunni Arabs, even though Iraq's Shia population was the majority. After 2003, Shia parties gained new political power, while many Sunnis felt excluded, punished, or threatened. This imbalance helped turn political competition into armed conflict. The insurgency was not one single movement with one goal. It was a fragmented and evolving war, driven by occupation, revenge, ideology, fear, and the collapse of trust between communities. By the mid-2000s, Iraq had descended into sectarian civil war. Shia militias and Sunni insurgent groups fought not only coalition forces, but also each other. Bombings of mosques, markets, police stations, and neighborhoods intensified the cycle of retaliation. Civilians suffered the most. Families were displaced from mixed areas, and many Iraqis came to identify checkpoints, militias, and uniforms not as signs of security, but as sources of danger. The violence was especially brutal because it blurred the line between political conflict and communal survival. People were targeted for where they lived, how they worshipped, or what name appeared on their identity documents. The invasion had removed a dictatorship, but the absence of a stable and trusted political order allowed fear to become one of the strongest forces in the country. In 2007, the United States changed strategy with what became known as the troop surge. President Bush ordered a major increase in forces, with roughly 170,000 U.S. troops deployed in Iraq at the surge's peak. The aim was not simply to fight insurgents from large bases, but to protect the population, secure neighborhoods, and reduce sectarian killing. The surge coincided with other developments, including Sunni tribal movements that turned against al-Qaeda in Iraq, an extremist group that had alienated many Iraqis through its brutality. Violence declined in several areas, and the security situation improved compared with the worst years of the Civil War. But the surge did not solve Iraq's underlying political problems. It created space for compromise, yet lasting reconciliation depended on Iraqi leaders building trust across sectarian lines. Iraq did take important political steps after the invasion. The country held multi-party elections in 2005, a major change after decades of authoritarian rule. A new political system emerged, and Nouri al-Maliki became prime minister in 2006. But elections alone could not repair a shattered society. Maliki remained in power until 2014, and his government was widely accused of alienating Iraq's Sunni minority through exclusionary and sectarian policies. Many Sunnis saw the state as dominated by rival factions, rather than serving all citizens equally. This mattered because insurgencies thrive where communities believe politics offers no protection or representation. Iraq had institutions, parties, and elections, but the deeper challenge was legitimacy, whether citizens believed the new order belonged to them, or had been imposed on them and captured by their enemies. The human cost of the war was enormous and remains difficult to measure precisely. Estimates range from about 150,000 deaths to more than 1 million, depending on the method used, with over 100,000 civilians killed in many estimates. Most deaths occurred not during the initial invasion, but during the insurgency and civil war that followed. Beyond those killed, millions experienced displacement, trauma, damaged infrastructure, interrupted education, and the breakdown of ordinary life. For American and coalition forces, the war also carried a heavy cost in lives, injuries, and long-term psychological wounds. The financial cost reached into the trillions when accounting for military spending, veteran care, and interest. But numbers alone cannot capture what it meant for Iraqis who lived through years when the future of their country seemed to be decided by bombs, militias, foreign troops, and fragile governments. The war also transformed politics outside Iraq. In the United States, the failure to find WMDs damaged public trust in government and intelligence claims. President Bush's popularity declined as the war dragged on and casualties mounted. In Britain, Prime Minister Tony Blair's support for the invasion severely damaged his reputation and contributed to the political pressure that preceded his resignation in 2007. Internationally, the war weakened America's image, especially among countries that saw the invasion as unnecessary or illegal. It also affected future debates over intervention. Leaders became more cautious about intelligence assessments, military occupations, and promises that regime change could quickly produce democracy. The Iraq War became a warning about the limits of military power when planning for the aftermath is flawed or overly optimistic. U.S. combat forces were officially withdrawn in 2011 under President Barack Obama, after an agreement negotiated during the Bush administration set the path for withdrawal. But the end of the U.S. occupation did not mean the end of Iraq's conflict. The unresolved sectarian tensions, weakened institutions, and extremist networks left behind contributed to the rise of the Islamic State. By 2014, the United States was again engaged in Iraq, leading a new coalition under Operation Inherent Resolve as the conflict evolved into the fight against ISIS. The Iraq War's legacy is therefore not one simple verdict, but a chain of consequences. It overthrew Saddam Hussein, but at immense cost. It promised security, but produced years of instability. It began with claims that proved false, and it reshaped the Middle East in ways still felt today. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.